Good evening. I'm John Fugelsang. This is Viewpoint. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. President Obama apparently wasn't content with all the White House scandals headlines this week, or the possibility his second term could be suffocated under a blanket of congressional investigations. So he did something about it today. On the IRS singling out conservative groups seeking tax-exempt status for investigations, Mr. Obama condemned those actions again and announced changes at the agency enforced by new Treasury Secretary Jack Lew.
Today, Secretary Lew took the first step by requesting and accepting the resignation of the acting commissioner of the IRS. Because given the controversy surrounding this audit, it's important to institute new leadership that can help restore confidence going forward.
Our acting IRS Commissioner Steve Miller is now presumably looking for a new job, but whether that will satisfy congressional Republicans remains to be seen. Earlier today, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell demanded a different sort of action from the president.
The administration needs to make witnesses available to testify on this and on any other incident of targeting the administration's ideological opponents.
And House Speaker John Boehner has apparently made up his mind on whether IRS regulations were broken or real crimes committed.
Now, my question isn't about who's going to resign. My question is, who's going to jail over this scandal?
A scandal where no laws were broken. On the so-called scandal front, and yes, I mean Benghazi, the White House tried putting that one to rest yet again by releasing 100 pages of internal emails that showed how the talking points used by UN Ambassador Susan Rice were shaped. Rice and the White House have been blasted repeatedly for not immediately labeling the attack that killed 4 Americans a terrorist attack in an alleged attempt to deceive the American public to help boost the president's shot at re-election against the guy nobody wanted to vote for. But the emails reportedly show that the White House, the State Department, the FBI, and CIA all helped shape these talking points that Ambassador Rice used. And while interoffice politics may have played a role as that worked out, presidential politics apparently didn't. Though Speaker Boehner's spokesman has already accused the State Department of requesting, quote, political changes in the talking points. As for scandal number 3, the Justice Department's seizure of phone records from the Associated Press, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney announced the president would push Congress to pass a media shield law, which failed to get to the Senate floor for a vote back in 2009.
The president's support for this kind of media shield law is well documented. It is longstanding, and he does believe that it is appropriate to resubmit that legislation and to try to convert it into law at this time.
Meanwhile, up on Capitol Hill, Attorney General Eric Holder insisted for a second day he didn't know anything about the issue that we don't know.
I would like to try to pin down who authorized the subpoenas for the AP. Did the Deputy Attorney General Cole do that?
I have to assume he did. I only say assume because you have to understand that recusals are such that I don't have any interaction with the people who are involved in the case.
For more, I'm delighted to be joined by political reporter Joe Williams and by Josh Israel, senior investigative reporter for thinkprogress.org. Gentlemen, a pleasure to have you both here tonight on Viewpoint.
Good to be here.
Great to be with you.
Many thanks. So let's start with the IRS. Along with the forced resignation of the acting IRS commissioner, President Obama did say tonight he would work with Congress hand in hand, presumably, as it performs its oversight role, while putting in new safeguards to make sure nothing like this can ever happen again. So with that announcement and that resignation, has the president finally started to put this story to rest, or is it going to be a big GOP fundraising and Tea Party talking point through 2014 regardless? Joe?
2 words, cha-ching. I mean, basically, you already have the Republican campaign committee sending out emails saying, help us fight the president on Benghazi. Help us fight the president with these scandals. We need money to run people for Congress that's going to keep the pressure on. So basically, the fundraising has already started, and it's not a surprise to anybody in Washington who covers these things for very long. But I think part of the problem that's going on here is we're losing focus here, especially with Benghazi, especially with the other 2 sort of faux scandals. Typically, in these sorts of situations, what the real scandal is, not what's illegal, but what is legal. I mean, remember, we're living in a time where we have the Warrantless Wiretap Act. We've got FISA courts that are secretly giving permission to listen into people's phone calls. Yep. We've got different sorts of infringements on our civil liberty in the name of keeping us safe from terror. So what's going on in these situations is basically sort of the fruit that's being born from all the permission that we've been given to look into our past and look into who we've been contacting, who we've been talking to try to keep us safe.
Mm-hmm. Well, Josh, you wrote about how real disclosure laws could fix the IRS problem. So what has to be done to bring some clarity to what appears to be an incredibly muddy process where the IRS has to decide which groups are political and which are not?
Well, I think the president spoke very eloquently about one of the problems being that there's very little clarity as to what the rules are there. The IRS code suggests that groups, in order to be a 501c4, the sort of tax-exempt groups that we're talking about here, you have to be a social welfare organization. And campaigning and electioneering can't be your primary purpose.
Right.
But they give very little guidance as to what the heck a social welfare organization is or what a primary purpose is. So it would be great to see some sort of changes to the tax code that make it clear what is and isn't okay. A lot of the criticisms in the Inspector General report had to do with the fact that these low-level functionaries didn't even understand the rules. In some cases, didn't know the rules.
Right. Well,
but a big reason for the groups that are sort of masquerading as social welfare groups to avoid having to disclose their contributors is the fact that there is no disclosure for 501c4 groups when they run political advertisements.
Well, exactly right, and that's where it gets sticky. And Josh makes an excellent point. I mean, once Congress gets involved in this whole process, can you see those definitions getting tightened so the IRS can realistically tell which groups should get tax-exempt status, or loosened to the point where just about any group could pass? Or is this just about the GOP having something to beat the president with and nothing's going to pass Congress for 3 years?
This is the piñata that the GOP has been hoping for, because keep in mind, as we've been hearing a lot of these outrages from the right about what a scandal this is, about how dare they look into Tea Party organizations and fundraising groups on the right, very little is discussed about the actual law and about ways to keep this from happening again. And furthermore, there was not very much outrage when groups on the left were being investigated during the last Republican administration. I'm thinking of the NAACP. They were investigated for their tax-exempt status. Nobody raised an eyebrow. Nobody raised their voice in outrage on the right when this happened, even though clearly it's a very similar pattern we've got here. But I think what needs to happen is Congress needs to step in, needs to clarify, needs to tighten, but they're too busy talking about all these other issues, too busy using it as a political whacking stick to even get to that point.
Indeed. Gentlemen, let me bring it back to Benghazi for a second, because I can remember the quaint days of the Bush administration when a terrorist attack that killed Americans meant united we stand, and we got behind the leader. Now, of course, it's a chance to get political points off of the dead bodies of Americans. Will the release of these emails by the White House today finally satisfy the president's critics, or is this going to continue to be an issue, at least in the conservative bubble, for the next 3 years?
I don't think that anything could...
Please, Josh.
Go ahead, Joe.
Or Joe.
No, after you, Josh.
Wow, we're all so polite the Republicans should watch us.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think there's anything you could possibly do that would satisfy the sort of scandal-mongering crew at Fox News and Senators McCain and Graham. But I think this wasn't really something that the American people much cared about before, and now they're really not going to care about it. These emails show very clearly that it was the intelligence forces that were giving information to the president and, in these talking points, trying to keep people safe and trying to give the best information that they could, and that there was nothing politicized about the process.
Okay, well, that's a great point. But, Joe, let me ask you to that effect. I mean, this may be just a tool that the GOP will use to keep their base riled up, get them to show up for the midterms, get them to donate money all through the long summer while they put forth no new legislation. But will it be enough for the White House politically if Benghazi stays an inflamed issue for the right, maybe just on the farthest fringes of the right, instead of creeping towards the mainstream, as seemed possible not long ago?
It will have to be enough because, as Josh said, there really isn't a whole lot more that they can do. I mean, you have a head rolling at the IRS over the investigation scandal. There's really not a whole lot of dramatic action that you can take to satisfy the Benghazi critics that you would have to take in the IRS scandal. So releasing the emails just pretty much proves what the White House has been saying all along, and that is, look, it was a chaotic situation. We were trying to figure out what was going on, and we were going forward with the best information available while still trying to coordinate that information through the various agencies that had a hand in it. So I think it's going to have to be enough. I don't think it's going to go away, and it may have all the effects that you talked about in rallying the base, promoting fundraising, and giving the White House more to worry about in the 2014 midterms. But I might also add one other point. The countervailing balance that the White House might have here, and the other alternative strategy they might have to play is, while we're all discussing something that happened back in November of 2012, the sequester grinds on. The economy is still stumbling but not running, and we still have very much a looming fight over the debt ceiling that's not going to get resolved as long as we're talking about these three scandals.
True, but if you're in the GOP and you don't necessarily want the economy to get better on a Democratic president's watch, is not Benghazi still your best tool against Hillary Clinton's high poll numbers?
Well, it is, but it isn't. I mean, think about it. You talked earlier that most Americans don't really see, or Josh mentioned earlier, most Americans don't really seem to be engaged on this particular scandal. And indeed, a survey showed that if you asked a random sampling of Americans where Benghazi is on the map, many of them don't even know. And if it's about a terrorist attack on an embassy, that's about as far removed as you can get from stand behind the leader as if a terrorist attack occurred on American soil. I mean, keep in mind, if we're doing body count here, what happened in Boston was very much a lower casualty count than what happened in Benghazi, and arguably a lot less significant on the international stage, yet there was not a whole lot of unifying behind Benghazi, and there was behind Boston. That's because Boston was easier to grasp, easier for people to relate to than an embassy halfway around the world.
And West Texas had a higher body count than both incidents combined, but we don't hear about that at all anymore. Before we go, Josh, I'll give you the last word. Is the GOP stuck in a scandal loop from the 90s, like the first Clinton term, when our Republican friends pushed one fake scandal after another? I mean, does anyone remember what Whitewater was supposed to be about at this point?
I don't think anyone understood it then, and you had this constant stream in the 90s of Travelgate and Filegate, and it's very much the same thing here. The Republicans don't want to talk about immigration reform because they know that the public is to some extent against them. They don't want to talk about gun violence prevention. They don't want to talk about the economy because they're wrong on these issues. So, they try to distract by bringing up anything they can possibly throw at the White House. And I don't think much of it's going to stick.
Political reporter Joe Williams and Josh Israel, senior investigative reporter for thinkprogress.org. It's only going to get more interesting. It's great to have you both in the program. Hope to have you both back soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, John.
Good evening, gentlemen.